Right now I'm not going to remove anything on this side or on this side anymore, because I can remove the top plate as one piece, and when I put it back I will of course clean all this ugly stuff here and adjust the exposure meter if necessary, although that's very difficult with this type of exposure meter. And I already saw when I tested it that the exposure values are okay, so I don't think I will do a lot of adjustments here. So to remove the top plate, the first thing I would do is a very special thing. It's to pull out the shaft of this gear, and that's necessary, otherwise you won't get the top plate of the camera body. And to pull it out, I first loosen the screw here. And then there's a head pointing out on the right side, and I can try to catch it and pull it out like so. Yeah, now it falls into the body, that's not a problem. I will find it later. Now I secure it back. Okay, the top plate is held into the body by 3 screws, and they are here, here and there. The shutter just released. I didn't remember that it was still cocked, but that's not a problem. And there's 3 screws. Next I want to remove the shutter plate from the camera body, and to do so I first need to lift off some of this leatherette here to get access to screws underneath it. And to lift off the leatherette I find it better to first apply some solvent to it. And then I use the sharp screwdriver. Okay, I leave this end on because it's not necessary to remove the leather completely. I just need access to this screw, and there's also one underneath here, not seeable yet. Now I remove the 4 screws. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, now it should be possible to lift off the shutter plate. So last time I divided the camera into those three parts: the body, the top plate, and the shutter unit. And now I want to continue with repairing the shutter unit first. It can be winded and released by one and the same gear, and it's released by just letting it run down back. But as you see, it doesn't run down completely from its own. I need to help it a little bit, and then it executes. That's not really such a big problem, because the gearbox has a lot of energy, such when you fire this gear that engages this gear has a lot of pushes this gear a lot to run down completely. But in the best scenario, this would run down completely from its own. So I will start with taking off the front lens. The front lens is connected into the centered lens element by a multi-thread, and this is used for focusing. And to get the holes that line up with the screws of the front focusing ring at the same spot again later, I want to also insert the front lens element into the same position onto the centered lens element. And to do that, I usually turn it in until it stops, and then I note the state. So I took a picture earlier of this state, so I can always be sure later that I inserted it in the correct position. And the way I remember it in this case is that this hole aligns this notch on the centered lens element here. So now I simply unscrew it. It's a bit sticky, so I will relubricate it later. Also, what's very helpful later is the position where to start to insert it. And that's this position. So I also want to find a way to remember this. As you can see, someone already made a mark on the front lens element here, and that's pointing directly upwards, and that must be the inserting position. So somebody already did the work for me. When putting the lens back later on, I will of course also show this in the video, but I cannot warn you enough that the thread is delicate and you need a lot of patience, and if you do not do this carefully, you can damage the thread permanently. And I say this because it has happened to me, and then it's not repairable anymore. Next, I would like to remove the shutter unit from the shutter plate. To do that, I need to unscrew this ring around the rear lens element. These screws, as I said earlier, do not have anything to do with that, but I also will unscrew them later. Also, once I remove the shutter unit from the shutter plate, the aperture tension mechanism will release, because the tension mechanism is on the plate side and not on the shutter unit side. There is even a way to avoid that. Zeiss Ikon designed a screw here that you can unscrew, and then with a different screw that has a longer shaft you can insert here, and then if you remove the shutter unit, the tension mechanism does not release and you can put it back without retensioning it. But I always retension it anyways. It's not much more difficult, and I will put this screw back. Now I take off this gear. I'm not completely sure about this, but I believe that it could be non-symmetrical. That's why I always remember the direction it comes back onto the shaft. The way I remember this is if you look closely and turn it this way, you can see there's something like a change from left to right on this line. And it needs to be inserted back this way. Okay, now I will unscrew this ring finally. Careful not to damage the lens, of course. Now the shutter unit can be taken out. And what you just heard releasing was the tension mechanism for the aperture. Once I put it back on, I just need to find the position of this screw that will insert into this. Also this lever for the aperture will come into a certain notch. I will show it later, but it will be in this position here. Also the flash contact will connect to this thing, and then there's a cable that goes through the shutter plate over here, and that's the actual PC sync contact. Okay, so next I will put this aside and continue with the shutter itself. At the back side of the shutter, you can see very thin and delicate rings around the tubular lens mount, and the purpose is to adjust the perfect distance between the lens and the focal plane of the film in the factory. And they used rings of very different thicknesses, so of course it doesn't really matter for you because you just insert the same rings, and that's good. Just note that they can be very delicate because some are very thin and you don't want them to break apart. The spring around. The purpose is to close the shutter leaves automatically. Now I can also already get a feel about how much resistance there is in moving the aperture. There's quite a lot of resistance. I would say it's too much, and that's also probably the reason why it was too slow. Shutter leaves are better. Yeah, I think that's okay. Anyways, let's continue on the other side. to continue to remove the centered lens element, simply use a lens spanner. And this can be very difficult to unscrew. So I think to unscrew this centered lens element, you apparently need a lot of force with a lens spanner, and the problem right now is I don't have a good grip with my left hand. So I will just temporarily put it back onto the shutter plate. So for you it would be much more clever to unscrew the centered lens element before I removed it from the shutter plate. But that's not a problem right now. To insert it back, just make sure that this gear is aligned such that the wider notch, there's two of them, one smaller, one wider. The smaller one is, as I mentioned earlier, to fix it with this screw, but the larger one is to insert the lever of the aperture. And I fully open the aperture, and then it should be possible to insert it back on. Yeah. So now should have a better grip. Yeah. I can take it back off. And that's a centered lens element. Somebody left very interesting text on it with a lot of numbers. I have no idea what that means. But anyways, this is the inner thread of the focusing thread. So later I would clean that and relubricate it. Next is to unscrew this holding ring here, and to do that I first need to unscrew the securing screw, which is very small. And now I try to unscrew it. The reason I want to use a toothstick here is I cannot make any scratches with it. Can also do it with a screwdriver, but be careful to not make any scratches. The direction of inserting it back also matters. If you look closely, this part goes downwards. Now this is the cover plate, and this is the shutter speed setting ring. The shutter can be cocked by turning this lever, which is not well possible anymore because I already removed the speed disc, and then it can be released by this push button. Interestingly, what happens here is exactly that. If you turn, well, let me put back this gear. If you turn this gear, this lever will tension and cock the shutter by this lever, and now it's fully tensioned, and then this lever will push the push button once you release it, somewhere about here. Take off the push button. Now I want to take off the save timer, which is this unit. As well as the retard mechanism, which is this entire unit. Now this entire part is responsible for the flash sync. Here's the contact that is made once the shutter is released and the shutter leaves are open. Now let me first release this little spring here before I unscrew it. Now this retard mechanism is for the M sync. There's an X and an M sync on this shutter unit. The X sync fires when the shutter leaves are open. The M sync fires just a little bit before that. That's for the older flash bulbs. And interestingly, that is accomplished by just delaying the execution of the shutter a little bit by this retard mechanism. This is the main drive. with the main drive spring that I now untension. It's still in very good shape. And the main drive cam. Next, I also want to remove these two delicate springs. You need to be very careful to not lose them, as well as this little lever here. First spring. Second spring I will remove after I unscrewed the lever. On later Synchro Compo models, this is not a simple screw, so you need a certain screwdriver for this, but on old models you can simply do it with a normal screwdriver. So that's, as I think, a big advantage. On later models I would use this kind of screwdriver.